Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest. A very big welcome to today's episode. I'm delighted to introduce Lindsay Bingaman. She's director of SureAcademy, consultant and executive coach. With over 15 years of experience, Lindsay specialises in integrating psychometric data, technology, and AI to enhance leadership, team, and organisational development. She's known as a personality explainer, and she helps individuals and teams to understand how their personality shapes relationships and performance. She previously led emotional intelligence-based leadership programs at Telios Leadership Institute, and she now serves as faculty on the ICF-accredited Telios Coaching Essential program. Her expertise spans emotional intelligence, executive presence, and people data, with experience across government, healthcare, professional services, and non-profit organisations. Lindsay, a very big welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nia. So happy to be here. And it's not often you get to hear one's career summarized like that. So thank you for the warm welcome.
So tell us a little bit about your career. It seems that you've got the tech side and you've got the psychology side. How did those two things come together?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. So, well, first of all, I discovered Myers-Briggs in college and was like, oh my word, what is this thing? I felt like I had a manual for myself. And so from that point on, really sought like, how can I use this in my career? And then spent the first, 10, 15 years in consulting and coaching and really supporting people and teams and organizations to especially around emotional intelligence to develop self-awareness and positive relationships at work and positive cultures. And from that work got connected to my current company now, which is a software company that integrates psychometric data, AI, and technology into an app. And so it's kind of funny. I'm sitting here, now like 20 years into my career, like, oh, how did I get here? Because it's such a different world as you take something and in this kind of business world, this go-to-market world and technology from where I used to be, which was all about leadership programs and sitting together and doing a 2-hour introduction as each person checked in. And now I'm in this kind of like intense technology world, which has been an incredible education. So it's just been like a wild journey where I'm sitting here kind of wondering how I got here, but also feeling like in some ways I've been preparing my whole life for this job because of how it aligns so perfectly with my interests over the entirety of my life.
So tell us a bit more about how you use the tech, and particularly, I guess we're all interested in AI because we're all talking about it right now. How does the tech fit with the psychometrics? How do we get from, I guess, what we're all used to is either a form or an online form that you fill out all of the boxes. How does that work with the tech?
Yeah, so it works really beautifully and seamlessly. And like you were saying, for a majority of the past, 20, 30, 40 years, people have been doing these assessments in organizations, but a lot of times they're on paper or it's a PDF and you'll say like, "Hey, do you have your team's data or your data?" And they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's in my desk drawer or it's
Yeah.
in a folder on my desktop." And and that's great. It's helpful information, but what we're doing now is integrating that psychometric data, putting it in an app, putting it in your hand so that you can use it not just like, oh, that's interesting, I'm a red or I'm an owl, but as a real living, breathing data set that can be used and leveraged in powerful ways, especially in organizations. So we're kind of moving from that like insights piece to action and using the technology, using the algorithms to tell you, well, based on this, here's what you need to work on based on what you told us about you. And then also, here's this other person's data. Here's how you guys need to interact together to be more successful. So it just takes some of the mystery out of the relationship building phase, especially as we're in dispersed remote work setting where, you could easily only spend a few hours a week live with a colleague you're working with regularly. So it really just helps kind of like that we call it speed to relationship.
You talked a lot about using psychometrics when you're in an organization and about the relationships. I spoke to Nancy Parsons a couple of episodes ago, and she also works in the psychometric sphere. And she talked a lot about using it for recruitment.
Is that something you do? What are your thoughts about it? I know I've spoken to a lots of other people who have said, well, does psychometric pigeonhole people? How do we ensure that we get the uniqueness of people when we're using psychometrics?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, Nia, and one we have to like kind of trod carefully, I think, as people who are in this field. And I think in some ways, I'm a little familiar with Nancy's work, and in some ways, this data set is it's very predictive. And so, we can often say like somebody who has these preferences is going to be happy and successful in this role. But in other ways, I don't ever want to see people be put into a box or kept out of a role that they could be successful in because of their data or their, preferences. And so I think it's a really tough question for us to wrestle with around how do we use these responsibly but still stay open to how people can evolve, grow, and change. And this is where, like my background as a coach, I really hold the belief that like humans have the incredible capacity to change in ways that we never thought we could. And I've seen colleagues who were incredibly introverted and could never stand in front of a group grow and evolve and now do public speaking on a regular basis as part of their job. Or people who are big picture, hated spreadsheets, manage the fine details of a project. And so I think it's just it's an interesting and important conversation around how do we use these things to predict job success, but also not to keep people out of things that or take them out of the running for things they could be successful in.
It's interesting. So, watchers and listeners, if you are interested in psychometrics, finish watching or listening to this episode. There's also the episode with Nancy Parsons. Susan Muss and I also talked a little bit about this, and Alison Reynolds and I talked about MBTI. So you've got
Mm.
4 episodes here where you can go back and have a listen to other people's thoughts around psychometrics. So we are interested particularly in self-awareness and self-awareness as it aligns to leadership. From your perspective, with your knowledge and background in psychometrics, what does self-awareness mean to you?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at the emotional intelligence model, self-awareness there is really defined as emotional self-awareness. So in this moment, am I, able to name the emotion that I'm feeling and then, manage it productively? But I think to me, it means a lot more than that. It can be personality dimensions. It is the emotional piece. It's, what are my preferences? What are my interests? Like, what are my values? What do I care about? All of those to me are different dimensions of self-awareness. And I think the person I've seen do the best research on it recently is a woman named Tasha Eurich, and she describes it as internal and external self-awareness. So just that idea of like internal being all the things I just described. How do I sit down with myself, be reflective and become aware of all these things that are inside myself that only I can know and put my finger on? And then external self-awareness, which is what is the impact that I have on other people? So when I walk into a room, what energy do I bring with me? How do I make others feel? How do others feel about themselves when they're with me? Which are all so important and actually it feels very rare sometimes that people truly carry that awareness with them of the impact that they have on a room.
Yeah, most definitely. That definitely aligns with my view of self-awareness that it isn't just reflection, it's about that recognition of your impact on others. And also for me, it's about regulation of your behavior, which I
Mhm.
suppose is a lot about what you talked about earlier in terms of once you've done your psychometric test, you have all this information about yourself, and now you can make some choices about any changes you want to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what self-awareness is all about, is that it gives you choice. So, okay, this is a strength, when am I going to lean into it and dial it up? Or, this is an area where I know I need to work on, or like who am I interacting with? I'm interacting with another like powerful, dominant kind of personality type person. I can just kind of like let that side of myself roll. Or am I interacting with a colleague that needs a like warmer touch or appreciates a softer approach? And then how do I moderate that?
Definitely. At Sure People, you focus on human potential. What do you mean by that, and how do you help people lean into it?
Yeah, I mean, human potential for me, it's about self-actualization. It's about where does the person want to go? What do they want to do with their life? So it's less of an objective thing, like, oh, this person could be this and defining success objectively and more about what do they want, what do they value, and then enabling them to understand themselves so that they don't get in their own way. So it's about leveraging strengths. It's about, understanding where they could get in their own way so that they're able to grow and do that. With the psychometric information, that gives the awareness of like, ooh, this is how I'm wired. And I think sometimes it's interesting because people will have a sense of themselves, but then sometimes when you see the data represented objectively, it's like, whew, there's been these moments of instantaneous awareness or like seeing themselves, sometimes just represented by the strength of the graph. Like I'm thinking about one woman I was working with who came out as like a 90% feelings decider. And there was just this moment of like, oh, yes, that is, I'm so aware of that. And that is kind of part of what's causing paralysis for me in my life right now. And, so I can figure out how to navigate through that because I see it and I understand it in a different way. Or somebody seeing that they're, 40%, which is high on our scale for avoiding conflict.
Mm.
Okay, I see and understand what's getting in my way. And then having the technology and the AI, the algorithm there, it just takes it to a different level because now you have not just you saying like, oh, I see this and I can help myself, but you have this science-based algorithm that's saying, based on what you told us about yourself, here's what our algorithm says are the 3 or 4 points you need to intervene on to become even more effective. So, for example, for my personality, it's very people oriented. I'm cooperative. It tells me you need to be more assertive. Or I'm intuitive, I'm big picture. You need to be better at execution and planning. So it's just really lovely because it keeps it objective in a way and really precise. And then when you integrate AI, also like the piece that can help then coach me on how to get there, it's a really dynamic combination of technology and AI that we have today.
It's interesting. Colleagues and I are talking a lot at the moment about looking for different jobs, and we read the person specification, and a number of us have said, yes, I can do this, 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 and this. Oh, but I can't do that, and therefore I'm not going to apply for the job.
Mhm.
How does what you talked about potentially help us to get over that? Because actually, if we meet 90% of the job description, does this last piece matter?
Hmm. Well, it's so interesting. And what comes up to me first when you talk about that is like in our personality model, there's some personalities that run confident and there's some that run a little more hesitant. And so I feel like, what I kind of saw and understood, and there's gender in there, there's culture, there's so much that's also layered on top of this. But I think in what you were describing, there's a lot of people I work with who run that more hesitant dimension where it's like, working or coaching with them around that, it can be helpful to know that this is something that might be a bigger issue. And so to help them turn that alarm that's going off, like, ooh, you might not be, you're at 90%, but you're not at 100%. Like, okay, you run hesitant. So in your case, how can we help you turn that thing off
Yeah,
and move boldly forward?
yes. I like that. Moving boldly forward.
Yeah.
Definitely. What are some common misconceptions about leadership that you've encountered? And maybe this hesitancy or imposter syndrome is something that's you're coming up against.
Yeah. So I think, again, over the last 30, 50 years, a lot of this stuff is relatively new coming out of
Mm,
1950s, 60s, or even later. I think some of the classic misconceptions about leadership have really been like, I need to be the smartest person in the room. That's all that matters. I need to be tough. I need to make tough decisions and really show my dominance. When in reality, all the research over the last 30 so years is pointing to emotional intelligence as the differentiator between good and great leaders. And there's this exercise I've done over the last 10 years in a lot of these leadership workshops where it's called best boss, worst boss. You ask everybody, what was the worst boss you ever had? And it's classic. These stories come up and people still hold trauma from their old bosses in major ways. And then you switch and say, okay, who's the best boss you ever had? And it's so interesting to me because without fail, people will say they helped me. They could see potential in me before I could see it in myself. Like they were patient, they enabled me to grow, they understood, they were flexible. It is really rare that anybody says, even like they were the smartest person I ever, sometimes once in a while you hear that, or they were incredibly great strategists, or they were really good at time management. No, you never hear that stuff. It's always about how they made the person feel. And so I don't mean to over-index and say it's all about being soft and kumbaya and, you know, no, you still have to make tough decisions and have hard conversations. But really, I think what's so interesting is just at the end of the day, like that's the relationship, your ability to support people and help them grow is really that what it means to be an inspiring leader and what makes a great leader.
We often talk about poor performers, and a number of coaches that I've spoken to will often have people come to coaching and they have to work through psychometrics because somebody has sent them to coaching without really tackling a performance issue. So you talked about using psychometrics when you're in an organization. How do you use them with poor performers? Because what you don't want to do is to use shock tactics, I
Hmm.
imagine. How do you use it to move those people to that point of awareness so that they can have that aha moment to move them forward?
It's a really interesting question. And, with coaching, as I'm sure you're aware too, it's like it has to be client led.
Mm.
So it's a really tricky situation of kind of saying, like, what do you care about? How do you want to grow? And like also, oh, we have some feedback here. This is something you could be better on. So how do we kind of like get you to lead it and want to grow? And I think the whole school of thought that I've really been trained in is around a model called intentional change, which is about, switching from this remedial approach of like, this isn't working and how do you fix it to, well, who do you want to be as a leader? Who do you want to be as an employee? What do you want to accomplish in this life or in this role? Okay, and now once you know that, what's getting in your way? So I think that's kind of the approach I would tend to go. And then I think when it comes to the tools, the psychometrics and whatnot, we've seen that like when you do the kind of self-awareness piece of the psychometric prior to doing a 360 or prior to having some of these conversations, people are actually more receptive to the feedback because there's a sense of like, oh yeah, now I know how I'm wired and I've accepted and agreed with that. Now I see how people could perceive that I don't care about them, or people could perceive that I'm disorganized, or whatever it is, because they kind of have a little bit more self-awareness, so some of those defenses go down.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it, that actually there's a way that you can get to that level of awareness that actually helps people break down those barriers so that you don't have this sense of you're clearly wrong and I'm right and I'm going to continue performing badly, but actually there's an acceptance along the way.
Well, exactly. And it's like, oh, it's less threatening. It's not like, oh, I'm a bad performer or I'm a bad employee. It's just, no, I have a preference for spontaneity and therefore I'm, like less structured. So it just helps depersonalize some of that.
What kind of work are you doing in organizations or with individuals where there is high stress or uncertainty in their roles? How are you able to support them? And I guess we can never get away from stress. So how do you support them to live with stress in their workplaces or to move on?
Yeah. So, one of the things that's measured in our psychometric is like how you shift under pressure and then also your conflict style. So these are two that are really key in creating, especially awareness around in those moments when the heat turns up. What does it look like? How might people experience you differently? How might you experience yourself differently? So I think that's the first step is just creating some awareness and like, how do I change? How do I shift in times of stress? But then I think kind of moving up to the group or team level, this kind of stuff is so helpful because when the heat turns up, we get more stressed, we get more black and white in our thinking, and we get much more prone to outbursts, to not managing ourselves, and to having relational hiccups that are often at the times when we can least afford it.
Yeah.
So I think in those moments, having this kind of data around to say, okay, ooh, I see that I'm under stress. I'm going to take a step back, or to have kind of at your fingertips, here's some tips to be more successful when interacting with this other person can really help avoid those moments where, if you think about the relationships being the piping in an organization through which all the communication and information moves through, in a moment of stress, you have a tense interaction, like that pipe gets blocked
Hmm. I
often and
like
we
that.
yeah, we
Yeah.
withhold information and we shut down and we kind of say, well, forget that. I'm not going to talk to that guy again unless I absolutely have to.
Mm.
And so I think that's where, like, if you can avoid that or use this information to get back in relationship and make the repair really quickly, this is where it can be like a decoder ring in helping people understand what's going on, what the breakdown is in the relationship, and then how to kind of depersonalize it and repair really quickly.
Have you ever had people receive the findings of their psychometric and say, this is totally wrong? This is not me at all. No, I don't believe you. This is just a load of nonsense. What do you do with that?
Yeah, no, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And here are the three situations where I often see it. One, the person is incredibly precise in our personality model. And so they're looking at line by line and kind of saying, well, that third word in sentence 4 isn't quite how I would describe myself. So there's a little bit of disagreement there.
Okay.
Also, if people have had a lot of change in the last few years. So there was one woman I was having a conversation with her portrait, and she was having a hard time seeing herself. And I said, well, have you had any change in the last 5 years? And she said, yeah, I had 3 kids.
Ah,
And, so it just led to this conversation around like, oh, okay, like she was just a different version of herself and didn't totally recognize kind of how she was showing up because of this massive change. And then I think sometimes too, when people are in toxic work environments or in roles where they're really struggling and not thriving, sometimes they've so adapted or they're
mm.
so operating out of kind of their natural preferences or that they've lost kind of touch with who they are or what so in those moments I try to take people back like, okay, in high school or over the course of your life, what are words that people would have used to describe you to try to get back to the essence of how they have historically known themselves to be?
So if you have somebody who is, yeah, I agree with some of this, I don't agree with everything. How do you coach them to use the learning to be constructive?
Well, one of the most important principles to me in using this stuff for coaching in organizations is the individual is always the expert on themselves. So you will never find me or hopefully anybody else at Sure People saying, well, if you just look at the data, this is who you are. Like I know more about you than you know about yourself because I have this data. No. So sometimes, if somebody has that reaction, we'll sit together and say, okay, is this a little bit of a blind spot? Let's explore and let's talk it through. Or is this just something that like was misrepresented or came out this way in the assessment, but for some reason you don't resonate with it, even though that's what you told us about yourself. And that's fine. That's those we are as humans are incredibly complex. And so while the data set can be incredibly helpful and there's value in it, we don't hold to it more than allowing for the incredibly complex human in front of us.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of describing it. I joined a webinar on the Future of Work Scotland a few weeks ago, and Stephen Morris was on there talking about that challenge between hard skills and soft skills, and I call soft skills relational skills. How can leaders really balance that awareness of the emotional intelligence and the hard skills? And I think a lot of what we've talked about is though that softer side, that relational side. But what happens if actually I'm supposed to be a technical expert in my leadership role, but actually I'm not really aware that my technical expertise is not as good as everybody else? Where does that go if we're talking about that difference?
Yeah, some of this I see reflected just in natural preferences in the data set we have, or in a lot of, you'll probably see versions of this in any data set, where it's like some of us are more naturally soft skill people oriented, and some of us are a little bit more hard skill task oriented. So for myself, I'm like a double-fisted people person. Like I'm just, loved listening. I'm curious about people. Where I know that I need to develop is some more of that like strategic thinking, execution, having difficult conversations, hitting conflict head on, so depending on how you're defining hard and soft skills, I think we're versus other people who, a lot of our classic leadership profiles, they need to round out more on some of the softness.
Yeah.
And this can be especially interesting when you layer in gender. I have a very classically female profile. I'm warm, I'm nurturing, like Whereas I work with a lot of women who have a more typically maybe features that we would more associate with men or masculinity of being direct, bold, decisive, precise. So that can also, I'm allowed for the full expression of my preferences, whereas some of my other female colleagues or people of color, a lot of different people we talk to talk about how some of us are allowed to express our qualities more so than others. So with the data set that I work with, I think it's really more about social, emotional, adaptive growth is how I would frame it as well. Like, who do I need to become in order to grow in my career, and a little bit less about the technical, because there's kind of like often you're thinking about two different buckets, like how do I need to grow and shape myself differently and become a different type of person? And then there's kind of like, what do I need to learn? So this definitely indexes more on the former and less on the latter around growth, as a person, but less about the technical kind of hard skills, which would be assessed in a different type of way.
And I think that's a good thing because you mentioned earlier that actually we do focus a lot more on the hard skills and far less on the relational skills. But I think that's starting to tip over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think COVID changed us. And it started to really focus that conversation around relational skills. You mentioned a data set a few times, and I'm really interested to know, you've probably got years worth of data now. What are these key things that are coming out of your data set?
Yeah, so the one I work with is called Prism, and it measures 54 traits and attributes. And, I think we have like 10,000 plus Prism profiles now. So it is really interesting to see. We have a lot in healthcare, and that's where I've seen some of the trends. And, the first framework is has four different quadrants, and one of the personality quadrants there is about high power, bold, direct, decisive people. So one of the trends we're seeing is that they like rise to executive roles. Like you'll find them more commonly there. And I don't think it's necessarily because they're more skilled. It's just that's where they like to live. They like to be in charge. They like to be authoritative. And then we found that like people at the director level or lower were more highly represented in some of the other more cooperative, people-oriented quadrants. And which again is not surprising. I think that's just where they feel more comfortable living. But one of the other interesting trends or findings we've started to uncover is that that bold kind of direct, decisive personality type group has a really high threshold for conflict, for stress, and for endurance. And you would
Okay.
think that they would be the ones that were less likely to burn out. But actually, what we were finding is they were reporting higher levels of burnout. And I
Okay.
think, what was going on is like the more sensitive group is more quick to say, oh, I think I'm burning out. I need to find other people to support myself, or I need to slow down, or I need a cup of coffee in my window seat, or, whatever it is, where that high power group are better, like it, or better, worse at like turning off their body and emotional signals and just pushing through. And so we'd find like they're in the hospital before they're like, oh, maybe I do need to slow down. So it's just kind of interesting when you have this data at that kind of level, you can start to see some pretty interesting trends like that.
When I did my research, I was interested in self-awareness at different levels of hierarchy. And the research, the literature at the time was saying that individuals at the strategic level of organizations are far more self-aware. When
Hmm.
I did my research, people were telling me the opposite, that actually
Yeah.
people at the high level were not self-aware at all. They would stab you in the back if they could. They would pull the rug from under you. And was the general feeling that people had. What is your data telling you about senior people and self-awareness?
Oh man, there's so much in it. And, I guess just I'll first start with just kind of my anecdotal, I think to get to certain levels of leadership, it does require a lot of emotional intelligence, and self-awareness is at the heart of emotional intelligence. So it makes sense in that regard. But we also know power can shape and
Mm.
change your brain and make us less self-aware. So I don't feel like I can empirically weigh in on that from our data. I will say again that like that bold, direct, decisive personality type is more highly represented at the top of the organization. You know that in any executive group, C-suite group, there's going to be a high percentage of them that are represented there. And I will say that that group tends to have a smaller radar for emotional data. So I won't say that they're less self-aware, but I will say in my experience and what our data indicates is like they might be less sensitive to picking up on all the different kind of emotional tremors in the room.
That's interesting. So
Yeah.
we really need to keep an eye on what the data is saying to you, and maybe we will be having some reports in the next year or two on your data.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things in my role that I'm really hoping we can kind of continue to get more from
Amazing.
the field and package and really, share a lot of our learnings as we look at these trends. And that's where the technology and the AI are also incredibly helpful in capturing some of this in more powerful ways so we can intervene and support people better.
Amazing. Lindsay, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think psychometric tests are fascinating, and I think they're a very interesting tool, and I think they are helpful at a particular point in time, and they do uncover your blind spot. And I think we need to go back and revisit our psychometrics because, as that person you said you talked about who had three children in 5 years, a lot can happen in our lives, and we can change and we become different people. But I think they are really interesting tools, and there's so much data and so much science behind them that there's just got to be something in it. So I'm a
I
fan.
couldn't agree more, Nia. And it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for having me and sharing your wisdom as well in the conversation.
It's been brilliant. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me.
Look forward to talking soon.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.